Hey there. Welcome to The Climate Cycle, a podcast focused on Canada's climate tech ecosystem. In each episode, we sit down with founders building climate solutions right here in Canada to better understand the challenges presented by climate change and what we can do about it. In today's episode, we're sitting down with Vida Gabriel, co-founder of TerraFixing, a startup working on direct air carbon capture. TerraFixing has developed the only direct air capture technology that's optimized for capturing CO2 in cold climates, and they're working to enable northern industry and underserved indigenous communities to decarbonize. Carbon removal is a fast-growing but technologically challenging area, with companies exploring many different ways of removing carbon while balancing difficult trade-offs like energy use, competing land use, the cost of removal, and more. I wanted to talk to Vida to better understand carbon removal as a whole, but also how it fits into our collective climate efforts. While we urgently need to decarbonize, we also need to start drawing down our historical emissions. Case in point, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, says we need to remove at least 5 gigatons of CO2 per year by 2050 to avoid the worst effects of climate change. In my conversation with Vida, we unpack how TerraFixing's carbon removal actually works, why they're focusing on cold climates, and their journey from academic research to starting a carbon removal company. We also unpack some of the criticisms of carbon removal, like it's too expensive or distracts from reducing emissions, and talk about what role carbon removal should play. It's a great conversation if you've just heard of carbon removal or you know the ins and outs of the space. Let's get into it. Welcome, Vida. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Justin. Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, really glad you could come on the podcast. Really looking forward to unpacking what TerraFixing does and the world of CDR. So maybe we could start there. Could you tell us a little bit about what TerraFixing does and how did the company come to be?
Of course. TerraFixing is a startup that has developed a direct air carbon capture technology. So what we do is we clean the atmosphere from CO2. We know that carbon emissions are bad and they're causing all sorts of problems that relate to climate change, for example, global warming. And there are so many initiatives, companies that are trying to reduce their emissions, they're trying to improve the way that their industries and technologies operate. But one of the things that we've realized, and the IPCC does a great job at highlighting, is, even if we stop putting emissions up into the atmosphere, we've got a whole lot of accumulated CO2 that's in the atmosphere that would continue this warming effect. And so TerraFixing, like a couple of other companies out there, has developed technology to literally take atmospheric air, we pull it in, think of it like a very large vacuum, and then we separate out or capture the CO2 in an effort to clean the atmosphere. We then compress it and send it to durable storage.
Awesome. That's a solid intro. So tell me a bit about the origins of this company and how it all kind of came to be in the first place.
Yeah, I'd love to tell you a bit about that. My co-founder, Dr. Sean Wilson, is one of the foremost experts in gas separations and specifically pulling out carbon from carbon dioxide dilute sources. My co-founder and I are chemical engineers by training. We overlapped in our graduate studies. I had just started my master's at the University of Ottawa, and he was halfway through his PhD. The field of adsorption, which is, so if I were to tell you absorption, it's like what your stomach does or what the body does when you eat food. It takes the nutrients in. Adsorption is different in the sense that it's a physical interaction. So if you're thinking about, Velcro that kind of sticks together and you can pull it away from each other, that's the principle of adsorption. When you stick a magnet to the surface of a fridge, that's also a physical way of it sticking, but you can remove it. The field of adsorption is not a very sexy field, and it's not the kind of PhD topic or master's topic that you'll hear very many chemical engineers go, yeah, I'm so interested in that. People want to get into polymers and photovoltaics and whatever. Sean was a little different. Yeah, he funded his own research by basically working with a company, doing some research, and part of that involved him going to the university, and then he realized, oh, I could be doing a PhD at the same time. So how the company came to be was Sean realizing that there was a huge gap in the literature. He noticed that in industry, all separations of gases end up going towards adsorption-based principles. versus absorption. And I'm not going to get into too much of the details, but he noticed that that was not the case in carbon capture, and he wondered why. When digging a little bit further into it, one of the great things about absorption or chemical-based capture is that it can be selective. If you have a chemical reaction and you have a reactant, it's going to selectively pick what to bind with. And so this is very helpful for CO2 because it's so dilute in the air. You need 1.3 million meters cubed of air to capture 1 ton of CO2. So the industry went to more chemical-based absorption processes for capturing carbon. But then Sean realized that, no, we can do this with principles of adsorption, which require less amount of energy. Basically, if you capture and react chemically your CO2, you have to break that bond eventually to be able to isolate that molecule of CO2. Whereas if you're doing it in a physical way, the energy requirements of that isolation are much, much lower. People weren't exploring something that for him just made so much sense. And the more he dug into it, the more he realized that he was really onto something and developed the technology, put a patent on it, and then incorporated TerraFixing. We did that together back in 2020. My journey, on the other hand, was a little different. I am a polymer chemist by training. I did sustainable polymer reaction engineering in both my master's and my PhD. And my project was about making biodegradable polymers. Something that weighed on my heart was all of the plastic waste accumulating in nature. And my vision was I would like every piece of plastic that's ending up in a landfill to instead be reintegrated in nature. And my hypothesis was that, okay, if I can develop these polymers to biodegrade in a composting environment, then I think I would make a huge dent. Being in the same department, Sean and I became friends. And one of the questions that Sean asked me was, okay, Vida, you're going to divert your plastic waste from landfill, but when you put it through compost, like what happens to that carbon? And well, microorganisms will come, they'll eat it up, and they will, poop out organic matter, and that's it. It'll be reintegrated. And he says, Vida, mass isn't destroyed nor created, it's transformed. Really, what is happening to your carbon? And then it kind of dawned on me that, yeah, some of that matter would be reintegrated into the soils, but these microorganisms exhale CO2. The majority of that mass would actually end up going into the atmosphere. And so I realized that if I really wanted to have a big impact on climate, I need to think about where the carbon is going to end up. And it just clicked to me. It's going to end up in the atmosphere. So if I want to make a big change and have a real impact on the climate, then I need to be grabbing the CO2 where it's going to eventually end up. And because of all the fossil fuels we've been burning, the Earth's natural ways of capturing and storing that CO2 back on the planet, like we've disrupted that. So now it's up to us to develop technology to go and to fix that greater issue. So I got involved in TerraFixing because I realized that the impact that I was having through my polymer work just wasn't big enough. I wanted to have that big impact, and I was one of the very fortunate people to have heard Sean's vision from the very, very early days. And I was just so inspired by it and by the technology that, I co-founded TerraFixing alongside Sean.
That's awesome. I really appreciate that approach of always looking for the biggest problem to solve. I think that's a really great way to come into the space of, cool, this is one space. Turns out there's a bigger mountain to climb. Let's go climb that one. Love that approach. So could you speak a little bit? I know that TerraFixing is focused on cold weather, CDR. And thank you for the explanation on absorption versus adsorption, because those are terms that I've definitely seen with different technologies. And I'm like, I think I get it, but now I actually think I get it. So yeah, could you talk a little bit about why the focus on cold climates specifically, and kind of how you see that differentiating TerraFixing in the CDR space?
Yeah, I would love to get into that. When thinking about the magnitude of this challenge that we have, we need a lot of carbon capture. And in order for technology to run, you need a couple of things. You need power, and you also need a place where you can durably store that CO2. If we look at it from an energy standpoint, separating gases, and CO2 is a gas into the atmosphere, separating gases that are cold is more energy efficient than doing it when it's warm. So think of it like heat is energy, And as molecules in the air have heat, they're moving faster and faster. If you're able to slow things down, then you're able to actually pinpoint and separate out the molecules that you want. So just from an energy standpoint, it saves a lot of power to be able to capture CO2 from cold air. So that's point number one. The second point is that there's less other stuff to separate out when you're using cold air. When it's warm, air can hold more moisture. And if there's humidity in the air, that's one extra thing that you have to be separating out before you can isolate your molecule of CO2. So just by operating in an environment where it's naturally cold, we avoid basically a whole step that other technologies have to do, which is isolating CO2 from water. We just naturally have less water we have to separate out. And dehumidification, as you can imagine, is quite intensive from an energy standpoint and a time standpoint. So these are some of the things that make cold climate operations so attractive. We believe that the far north holds the key to a low carbon world. And it's not only because of the ease of separating out CO2 from cold air, but it's also because we have significant renewable energy assets that have yet to be tapped into that we can develop so that, as we scale and reach the volumes of CDR that we need, well, we can also be scaling the renewables part of this puzzle of this project without taking it away from other uses that need it. So we think of it as if we're able to deploy in a location away from people, then not only are we avoiding like competition for useful land and NIMBYism and getting in people's backyards, we're doing great for the climate in a way that is kind of incognito. So we really see that, community engagement, and I mean, it can be quite catalytic to have a community backing your project. And in the same breath, if the community is not on board with your project, it can put everything to a screeching halt if you've got all the funding and all the technology and everything. So this is another one of the reasons why we think that the far north holds the key to a low carbon world. And I guess this is probably the part that I've skipped over that I'll mention now is the further north you go, the closer to the poles, the windier it is. We have the most insane wind power potentials in northern Canada, in Alaska, in Greenland. This is all just potential power that we can tap into. By developing a technology that can operate at 0 degrees Celsius and below unlocks that opportunity. And to date, no other direct air capture technology is designed to operate below 0 degrees C. And that's why we're very convinced that developing for the far north will really make a huge impact for the climate.
Yeah, that's a really incredible picture of the future and not competing for land use. I know that that's one of the biggest challenges for a lot of different carbon removal pathways is competing for land use. TerraFixing recently just signed a $10 million commercial agreement with a energy provider in the north. Could you talk a little bit about that agreement and kind of like even big picture, like what do you see the future of TerraFixing like deploying across the north?
Yeah, that commercial agreement. Very, very happy to have signed that and to have closed our seed round. Our partners are called Tugliq Energy. Their head office is in Montreal. They are our renewable energy partners. They're energy agnostic. They don't only do wind, they do solar, they do other renewables. And their mission is to decarbonize northern mines in Canada. Our economy has been largely driven by our natural resources, all of our forestry, pulp and paper, but also the minerals and the other things that we extract from the subsurface. But right now, those mining industries are quite polluting, and they also rely on diesel for their operations. And Tugliq has this vision of, well, these mines are already in northern locations. The potential for wind is huge. We want to come in and decarbonize those industries. But one of the challenges is that a wind turbine can last, the way that they're designed really is to last for 20 plus years. But let's say you go to a mine, the mine may be depleted in less time than that. There is a challenge of capex versus operational life, and this has been a barrier in the industry to be able to deploy wind specifically. And we saw an incredible relationship and synergy between what TerraFixing's technology can do and how it can enable the deployment of renewables. So the idea is TerraFixing's technology can also last 20 plus years. So by co-locating our direct air capture units beside the mine, we can be that supplemental power off-taker to then lower the cost of power, both for the mine and for ourselves. The other thing too is that when you're thinking about deploying renewables like wind, it's not consistent. The load of power that you get versus time can change. And so they're only able to reach, let's say, low to medium penetration of power. And what I mean by that is you have one or two turbines, and as long as they blow, yep, we can use that power. But if they stop, then you use something else like diesel, or you pull power from the grid. If they want to reach 100% coverage of renewables for the mine, that means that they have to oversize their wind farm deployment so that even at the lowest amount of wind, they still get 100% of their needs. But what does that mean? That means that for the majority of the time, there's huge surplus of power that is ultimately wasted. And this is very expensive. And so the idea here is we can enable the mines to reach full penetration by being that off-taker, by being able to use that wasted power, which reduces costs for us because the power is cheap, and also makes it possible for the mines to have access to renewables. And I say mines, but I also really also mean the communities that are nearby don't have access to energy. They're reliant on diesel. We need to provide them with energy independence in the same way that we have it. So this partnership, this commercial agreement, was really put in place not only for decarbonization, but also for truth and reconciliation. These communities that are far north are indigenous, and they don't have as many opportunity and as good living conditions as we have, and they've been disproportionately affected by the effects of climate change. And it's just one of the things that is very important to Tugliq, and likewise important to TerraFixing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was something that really jumped out to me. Learning more about TerraFixing and the focus on the north is this huge opportunity for indigenous participation and reconciliation and all of that. Seems like a perfect fit. It's also interesting seeing how intertwined CDR is with the rest of the energy system. Like it's not just this thing operating on its own. You have all these questions of OPEX and CAPEX for the wind farms and renewable energy sources and land use and all of this. Like it's much more intertwined than I think, is immediately evident.
Oh yeah, it's crazy, Justin. I did the math. My math may be a couple years old here, but I remember taking the numbers for the leading, like the energy requirements for one of the leading CDR companies, and their optimistic energy consumption was, I think, 4 MWh per ton, or 2 to 4, let's say. And I did the math. I went online and I looked at all of the renewables that are being produced in the USA: geothermal, solar, wind power, all of it. I added it all up. And then I took the energy requirement, the 2 to 4 megawatt hours per ton, and then I said, how much power would we need to capture just 1 gigaton? And the IPCC says that we need to capture, 5 to 10 per year, or something like that. If I just wanted to capture one, we would actually need 200%, so twice the current available renewable power in the United States.
Wow.
Just to capture 1 gigaton. So if you're not thinking about energy, you're going to encounter some real problems down the line. The power part is half the battle for sure. And so definitely this partnership that we have with Tugliq, I think, puts us in a really great position to have the impact that we want to have.
Yeah. It sounds like it, where you're both kind of playing into your strengths and working incredibly collaboratively together. Sounds pretty great.
Yeah, the founders of Tugliq have been excellent mentors to Sean and myself throughout, the journey of TerraFixing. So Pierre and Laurent, they're actually the angel investors that closed our seed round.
Right.
And on the leadership team include Guillaume, there's Nicolas, there's Carole, and the whole team are just so experienced and give so generously of their time and experience, expertise, advice, all of it to us. And so, over the years, we've definitely built such a great bond with that team, and the synergies just keep seeming to grow, and we're really happy about this.
That's fantastic. Cool. I'd like to maybe pivot a little bit and talk about maybe CDR a bit more broadly. So people have a lot of opinions on carbon removal and where it fits into how we're addressing climate change. There's a couple of, I think, common criticisms that keep coming up in the media specifically, but even just in like the broader conversation, that I'd like to kind of unpack with you. So there's kind of two, but the first one is this idea that CDR and carbon removal is a distraction from decarbonization. The government funding, the VC dollars, whatever, going into removing carbon and carbon removal, that should all be moving into decarbonization. We shouldn't worry about removing carbon until we've further decarbonized. I'd love to get your kind of thoughts on that.
We need both. There's no question that decarbonization is important. There's no question about it. If there's an athlete who's doing stuff and they're hurting their knees really badly, yeah, we'll stop jumping from 20-foot, heights and landing on your knees. That for me is the decarbonization front. But right. At the same time, okay, there was damage made to the athlete's knee. We now need to think about surgery and other physio, what have you. So I think of it as, okay, well, if the athlete stops jumping and he agrees to stop jumping and there he is, well, now they're just left in so much pain and agony and they need a solution. And if we're not advancing our medicine in a certain, at a certain rate or what have you, then we're going to have all these athletes with needs and no one really to turn to. Okay, terrible example, but just to say that we need
think it
both
works.
Of these.
Yeah.
I'm glad you think so. We definitely need both. It's unfortunate that people are thinking to themselves that developing carbon capture technologies will give a license to pollute. That's certainly not the intent, and I can see how that may be a concern. Nonetheless, they're both absolutely needed. Like I'd mentioned earlier on in our conversation, even if we completely stop all the emissions, global warming would still continue to happen because of accumulation of carbon that's in the atmosphere. So people, I think, also need to realize that we have a lot of cleaning up to do. And it's tough to realize this because CO2 is odorless, it's colorless, doesn't have a taste. If it was a huge pile of trash, then people would, realize that, yeah, we have to be able, we need to get trucks to come and deal with this stuff, and we have to stop putting more onto the pile. I think that would be much easier for somebody to digest, but because it's so untangible to us, yeah, it's definitely a challenge.
Yeah. And the impacts of it are on such a delay that, we're going to feel the impacts of the carbon we're putting into the air now, maybe in 20 years. And I feel like that's another aspect. Absolutely, you can't see it and you're not really experiencing it in the moment.
And that's going to be extremely challenging. I don't remember the name of the article that I read, but they were mentioning that, even if once we do start pulling out significant amounts of carbon from the atmosphere and we start to really change things, like you said, there's going to be a delay. And then what's going to happen? The average person who is probably not as educated in these matters will say, oh, look, we've done all these things. And what benefits does it give? Nothing, because we're still getting the fires, we're still getting the tornadoes, and so I think it will be challenging, and as a community we'll need to be very aligned in our messaging and our communication and in educating each other in what it is that we're expecting. And yeah, it's normal that we're not going to feel the effect, but it's essential and it will save us a lot of trouble down the line.
For sure. The other question or the other point that I've seen kind of come up as well is this idea that carbon removal, it's too small, it's too expensive, it's not going to get us there. Yeah, would love to get your thoughts on that. Just people pointing out it's too small, maybe it's too expensive, and some of those, I don't know if those are misconceptions and your perspective on that.
Well, I definitely agree. It's not cheap and we're not at the scale that we need to be. I think if anyone says otherwise, you're living in La La Land. Those things are true. One of the biggest challenges here is the perception of the problem, and the way that it's phrased can make this seem very daunting. Humanity has achieved such remarkable heights in so many industries without seeing where they were now and where they wanted to go, because it happened in a natural way. And I think that one of the challenging things is that, as of today, it doesn't cost us to pollute. You pay for the gas you put in your car and you drive on your way, and there's this impact, and you're not charged based on your emissions. But on the other hand, if you want to make the conscious choice and the responsible choice, then you have to pay. So that, I think, is something that that will be changing, and it needs to. But one of the things that makes CDR more criticized is because we know where we are today and we know where we need to be, and all we see is that huge gap. Let's take the computing industry, for instance. If we look at the evolution of computers, processing power and memory, I remember the floppy disks, this 800 kilobyte or megabyte floppy disks that I used to play with, that my dad used to drive my dad nuts with, sliding that little metal component and sticking my fingers in it. So okay, let's say we're back in the 80s or the 90s, and we have those floppy disks. Imagine Bill Gates turns to his engineers at IBM and says, "Oh, great job on the kilobytes there. I need you to give me a terabyte, and I need you to put it on a chip that's the size of my pinky finger." The IBM engineers would have turned around and called him absolutely crazy. The cost that would take, the time, the scientific innovation isn't there yet. They would freak out, and they would say that is completely unaccessible, unattainable. But look at where we are today. We've achieved this and more. So I got my first cell phone in the 7th grade. It was a Crazer. I shared it with my sisters. Loved that phone. And I remember my dad told me that, Vida, there's more computing power in the cell phone in your hand than the technology that was used to send the first rocket ship to the moon. And so it puts us into perspective. We got there, and we got there naturally. There was hunger, there was excitement, there was people trying to push the boundaries of technology. It happened organically, and so we didn't really question it. Now it's different because we have experts and climate scientists that are telling us that we need, okay, you're capturing a couple of kilograms now, a couple 100 tons, 1,000 tons, 4,000 tons. That's great. You need 100 gigatons by this date. And so people seeing that gap and where we are now, and I think that's a challenge. So I think when people talk about, or when people are skeptical if we can get there, I like to point to these examples to remind them that as humankind, we've done more extraordinary things. And I see this as just one of the other amazing things that humanity is going to be able to achieve. It's just going to take time. It's going to take some innovation. Yep. Some companies will succeed, some companies will fail. There's no question there. But what it is that we're doing right now, we're building an industry that needs to be the size of the oil and gas industry. That's basically what we're doing. And so there isn't going to be one winner or one loser. There's going to be a portfolio of different technologies that have their advantages in some types of climates, some that have advantages in others, some that integrate really well with existing infrastructure, some that can be standalone. So I really see this, and I want to remain very optimistic about this and remind everyone that humanity has done greater things than this.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think keeping in mind, though, the learning curves that you were talking about from other industries, learning curves happen. We know how to do this. The costs will come down. The tons removed will go up. I think one of the things that frustrates me sometimes around this topic is that we won't get that learning curve if we don't try, and we don't try it at small scales and learn and grow and do it at a larger scale and a larger scale next time. Like, we need these kind of early steps to then lead to the next exponential steps.
Well said, Justin. Well said.
Cool. The next thing I want to talk about is just a bit more your experience building a hardtech company like TerraFixing in Canada. So, and even if you want to talk about in Ottawa, would love to hear a bit about, what you think is going well in the ecosystem, what's not going well, maybe what you'd like to see different in the future.
Yeah, building a startup, a hardtech company from the ground up. I'll put the disclaimer here that everything that I'm saying is from my own personal experience. And if I can go back in time, I'm sure there's a million things that I would do differently. But the first thing that I'll mention is TerraFixing was founded in the heart of the pandemic. I was actually still doing my PhD when TerraFixing was co-founded, and I was able to juggle those two responsibilities kind of side by side. I have zero training, experience, what have you, in business. My co-founder and I are strictly engineers. Right. And so there was a lot we had to learn on the way. Pitch decks and business models and talking to investors who thought we were crazy and learning how to craft a story and learning how not to talk so techie. That was probably one of the very first hurdles that we had to pass. Learning what accelerator programs and incubators were, that I think was one of the most helpful things for us, especially for me, not having any background in business. That was definitely a critical part of our growth at TerraFixing. Getting funding when you don't have a reputation is really hard, Justin. People saw Sean and myself as these two random students who had an idea in the lab and who wanted to develop and ask for millions of dollars to develop, and what credibility, what background, what do you have that can back you? And that part was definitely challenging. There were so many times in which the only feedback we got from a rejection of a grant application or similar was, oh, it seems like a great idea, but I don't think you have the right resources, the right capacities. We nailed all the technical criteria of innovation and how this can make a difference, but it was just doubt. And that's totally understandable. If we're talking about taxpayer dollars, I'm glad that, these organizations are doing their due diligence. That part was definitely challenging. So I'd say from that perspective, it was learning a lot about, how to get the right technical support, the right mentors, how to communicate better and less techie. The worst thing is for you to bore the examiner in your application that they don't want to get through your application fully because you're way too it's definitely, you have to strike the right balance of being interesting but also demonstrating the tech that you have. Something that really helped was that we had a couple patents and trade secrets under our belt from day one. I think was definitely our saving grace. And the fact that Sean, my co-founder, is known as one of the experts in gas-based separations. The field of adsorption is very niche, and he was very much at the forefront, so that was certainly helpful. Other things that helped are our experience building hardtech. There's a lot more funding for software that we just didn't have access to. Another challenge is definitely finding lab space and being able to do R&D. Universities across Southern Ontario are lacking space for their own profs and their own research groups. So trying to piggyback or borrow some space is really not an option.
Right.
Or at least for the uses that we needed to. So yeah, I think overall it's been a lot of learning these last 4 years. We've had a lot more non-technical challenges than we've had technical challenges. Yeah, right. Definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so blown away that I've started this company and had all the success you've had, learning all the business aspects, like as you go. Like it's wildly impressive. Reflecting on all of that, what would you like to see different in the ecosystem?
I would love to see larger pool of funds that could be sectioned off into first of a kind. I guess what I'm going to make reference to is the SDTC seed fund. Something like that can be very catalytic. And the reason why it's there is to be able to get small startups like off the ground sooner and get them kind of in the pipeline of funding. Because as soon as you've been vetted by another reputable organization, it gives confidence to other organizations and funders and investors to invest in you. It was really unfortunate that SDTC stopped their funding program. They have since resumed it. I think now they've moved the ownership of those funds to another part of the government. So it's reopening, but I'd say one of the things that could be more catalytic is more grants and funding for the curiosity aspect to help get the proof of concept done. And that's outside of a university. So these funding opportunities are possible and professors can get them and all of this. But for a company that's not spinning out of a university, it's very hard to access those. I'm trying to think of what could have been very catalytic for TerraFixing early on. And it's if we were able to have some FaceTime with some of the evaluators of our grant applications to just explain to them what it is that we were trying to do instead of them just reading on a piece of paper, so that we could potentially have even a fraction of the funds that we are hoping to get something going. I think that would have been very nice.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. We're looking forward a little bit more. What are TerraFixing's main goals over the next, let's say, 1 to 2 years?
To get that 1,000 ton per year model and 4,000 ton per year model out in the field, testing, operating. That is what we are focused on. 100% full force, all steam ahead. I don't know if that's the right expression. That's what we're working on.
Awesome. Yeah, I would imagine that's going to be a big undertaking and require a lot of your focus. Is there anything else we didn't touch on that you think we should have talked about?
This is a really exciting space. If there's one note that I'd like to end off on is like a very optimistic note. Unlike other industries, and I'm not saying this firsthand, this is kind of a secondhand sentiment that was communicated to me because I haven't worked really in other industries, but it's a very friendly and collaborative space. I find that the companies are not trying to tear themselves down. We all realize the magnitude of this problem, and there's just so much collaboration. I was fortunate to attend Carbon Unbound, and that was sponsored by Mars and the Consulate General of Canada. Thank you to them for being able to sponsor Ticket for TerraFixing. We were able to go to Carbon Unbound and met with so many other leaders and innovators. And you would think that it would be cutthroat. There's just a couple of buyers for credits. There's only a couple of investors that are coming in. And you'd think that we would try to be talking each other down. Our tech is better because you should purchase CDR from us because, but that's not at all what it is. It feels like the industry, even though it's so young, it's so mature in the sense that it realizes the broader impact and what kind of a change that we want to make. And so I'm really grateful that the industry is this way and that people are collaborative and helpful, and a bunch of us founders in many different companies exchange phone numbers and our first name basis and exchange opportunities and ideas and get on calls semi-frequently to just discuss things and get each other's opinions and ideas. And I'm really thankful that it is this way because it makes it so much easier to tackle those hard challenges that we will inevitably encounter as tech developers trying to develop something so new and novel.
That's incredible. Yeah, I guess that's the positive sum mindset where you put all these things together, you know you're going to get something that's better than the sum of its parts versus that zero sum, if you win, I lose kind of approach. It's super cool to hear that that's kind of the environment that you're operating in.
Definitely.
Okay, well, we'll end off with a quick rapid fire. First off, what advice would you give to someone who is looking to make the switch into climate, either as a founder or just as someone who wants to make that their full-time career?
Get plugged in to different organizations that have a lot of information and that are willing to share. So I'd say, for example, there's the Air Miners community, there's Carbon Business Council. There are so many communities that have information that you can go in and learn. And I'd say as a first step, I would definitely dive into those, and the founders of those organizations and their employees will know where to point you for more and more information. So I'd say first, go and soak up all that's out there, then decide what you want to do, because trust me, there's a whole lot of work that needs to be done, and you're much better off doing something that you love than just trying to go in and do anything. And I'm sure there's going to be something in the field that you would adore. And then once you find out what it is that you want, then again, reach out to those networks and dive in. Again, we're building an industry that's going to be as big as the oil and gas industry.
Love it. Just get into it. Get moving.
Yeah.
Any recommended books, newsletters, or podcasts that have been really speaking to you or you think other people would really get a lot of value out of?
Ooh, that's a good one. One of the early books that I read that I really appreciated was Speed and Scale by John Doerr.
Oh, yeah.
Each chapter is dedicated to a different piece of the puzzle for our fight against climate change. So that one really opened my mind specifically to the energy problem, or the energy piece of the problem. That's one for sure. From a business perspective, I was recently recommended a book called Buy Back Your Time by Dan Martell, discussing different strategies for who your next hire should be. So as a startup that's growing its team, thinking, we've been hiring almost exclusively engineers, but realizing that in order for the business to grow and to grow in a good way, I like his philosophies on how hiring should be done. So that would be a second book. And then from a personal perspective, I really appreciated reading a book called Unwinding Anxiety. I cannot recall the author, but that one was really just for a personal mental health and emotional health, exploring the science behind anxiety and why the brain does it to us, and how we can develop different tools to deal with those things.
Awesome. I haven't heard of those two. I'm going to have to check those out. And the last one, any asks for the people listening?
Keep exploring the space, keep an open mind. I'm preemptively saying this, it's not up on our website yet, but a lot of people in our communities have been wanting to contribute to projects at TerraFixing, especially knowing the implications that we're going to have on northern communities and indigenous communities. So we're in partnership with TerraSet, setting up a platform in which we can take charitable donations that are eligible for tax receipts that are going to go directly to the project. So people wanting to tangibly contribute to these projects but don't know how, and they're just an individual and would like a tax receipt, we are actively working hard on getting that ready. So I'd say the ask is stay tuned. If you're someone who gives charitably, I really think that TerraFixing's mission may be aligned with your mission. Who knows? And if it is, then we would very much love to partner in that way.
Incredible. Cool. Well, Vida, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you coming on. And honestly, this was a very enlightening conversation. I learned a ton, so really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Dustin.
Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed today's episode, leave a rating and a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It would mean a lot and helps grow the show. To stay in the loop on Canadian climate tech news, recent fundraising, job postings, events, and more, subscribe to the Climate Tech Canada newsletter on our website. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.